Nobody expected Bob Price to solve the problem. After all, he was just a 28-year-old mechanic struggling to keep his failing garage afloat in Ridgefield, Arkansas. The kid who spent more time reading about tanks than fixing the cars that paid his bills. When that weathered 1943 Sherman tank rolled into town for the Veterans Day ceremony and 3 certified military specialists declared it unfixable, Ken Murphy made a cruel bet, waving $5,000 in the air and sneering that even the tank-obsessed kid couldn't solve what the experts couldn't. What happened next stunned the entire town. The struggling mechanic didn't just fix the engine that had been silent for decades. He diagnosed a manufacturing defect that military experts with advanced degrees had completely missed. And when General Mike Ward arrived to inspect the restoration, he offered Bob the words that would change everything: a Pentagon contract worth more than the entire town's annual budget. This is the story of how a simple bet exposed a hidden genius, how a young man's seemingly useless obsession with military tanks became his ticket to an extraordinary future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Price Auto Repair, a weathered building on the outskirts of Ridgefield that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from the metal siding like old skin, and the sign hanging above the entrance tilted at an angle that suggested it might fall at any moment. Inside the single-bay garage, Bob Price lay beneath a rusted 1998 Ford pickup, wrestling with a stubborn transmission that seemed determined to defeat him. "Come on, you piece of junk," Bob muttered, his voice echoing in the cramped space beneath the vehicle. Grease dripped onto his coveralls as he strained against a bolt that had apparently welded itself in place through years of neglect. At 28, Bob possessed the lean build of someone who spent his days contorting himself into impossible positions to reach broken parts. His dark hair, perpetually tousled and streaked with motor oil, framed a face that bore the concentrated expression of a man trying to coax life from dying machinery. The bell above the shop door chimed, announcing a visitor. Bob didn't emerge immediately, instead calling out from beneath the truck, "Be with you in a minute, just trying to convince this transmission to cooperate." "Take your time, Bob. It's just me." The familiar voice belonged to Diane Cox, owner of Cox Auto Parts, and one of the few people in Ridgefield who treated Bob's struggling business with genuine respect. She moved through the cluttered garage with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated similar spaces for years, stepping carefully around oil stains and discarded parts. Her practical clothing and no-nonsense demeanor reflected her position as one of the most knowledgeable parts suppliers in the county. Bob finally slid out from under the truck, wiping his hands on an already stained rag. His face lit up with a genuine smile, the first of what had been a particularly frustrating morning. "Diane, good to see you. Please tell me you've got good news about that water pump for the Henderson's Chevy." Diane shook her head apologetically. "Still backordered. Might be another week." Bob's shoulders sagged slightly. The Henderson job represented a significant portion of his monthly income, and delays meant customers growing impatient and potentially taking their business elsewhere. He tossed the rag onto his workbench, where it joined a collection of similar cloths in various stages of discoloration. Story of my life lately. Everything takes longer than it should, costs more than expected, and half my customers think I'm running some kind of charity operation. "Speaking of which," Diane said, her tone shifting to something more serious, "you might want to come down to the town square this afternoon. There's going to be quite a show." Bob raised an eyebrow. Ridgefield wasn't exactly known for its exciting events. The highlight of most months was the weekly farmers market, and even that struggled to draw a decent crowd. What kind of show? They're bringing in that Sherman tank for the Veterans Day ceremony. You know, the one Frank Weber donated to the town last month? At the mention of a Sherman tank, Bob's entire demeanor changed. His previously tired expression sharpened into something approaching excitement, and he unconsciously straightened his posture. Diane had seen this transformation before whenever anyone mentioned military vehicles in Bob's presence. A Sherman? What model? M4A1 or one of the later variants? Diane smiled despite herself. I have no idea, Bob. It's big, it's green, and it hasn't run in about 30 years. Frank's been trying to get it operational for the ceremony, but he's had 3 different mechanics look at it already. Bob moved to his workbench, ostensibly to organize tools, but really to hide his growing interest. His collection of technical manuals sat in a neat stack beside his regular automotive references, their covers worn from frequent use. The top manual, Sherman Tank Maintenance and Repair, bore particularly obvious signs of study. 3 mechanics. Huh? What's the problem? Engine won't turn over. Something about the electrical system or maybe the fuel delivery. Frank's getting pretty frustrated. He spent more money on that tank than most people spend on a car. Bob's hands moved automatically, straightening his tools while his mind raced through possibilities. Sherman tanks use different electrical systems depending on their production year, and fuel delivery issues could stem from anything from contaminated gasoline to corroded fuel lines. Without seeing the specific vehicle, he could already think of a dozen potential problems that might stump mechanics unfamiliar with military vehicle systems. Who's been working on it? First guy was Tommy Martinez from over in Conway. Then Frank brought in some specialist from Little Rock who supposedly works on vintage military vehicles. Last week, he even had Ken Murphy take a look at it. The mention of Ken Murphy's name caused Bob's jaw to tighten almost imperceptibly. Murphy's premium motors dominated the automotive market in Ridgefield and the surrounding counties, and Ken never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of his success. He drove the newest trucks, lived in the biggest house, and treated smaller operations like Bob's with barely concealed disdain. And none of them could figure it out. Diane shrugged. Apparently not. Frank's talking about just putting it on display without running it, which defeats the whole purpose of the ceremony. The Veterans Day Committee wanted to demonstrate it for the kids, show them how these machines actually worked. Bob tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside, his mind was already working through diagnostic procedures. Sherman tanks represented one of his deepest interests, a subject he had studied extensively through manuals, online forums, and correspondence with restoration experts across the country. He owned technical documentation for virtually every variant of the M4 Sherman, including maintenance procedures that most modern mechanics would never encounter. That's too bad. A running Sherman would really make the ceremony special. You know, Diane said, studying Bob's face carefully. Frank mentioned he might be willing to pay well for someone who could actually get it working. He's already invested, so much that he'd probably consider it worthwhile to try one more mechanic. Bob's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain casual. Jobs involving military vehicles were exactly the kind of work he dreamed about, but they were also rare in a place like Ridgefield. Most of his income came from routine maintenance on civilian vehicles, work that paid the bills but left him feeling unfulfilled. I'd be interested in taking a look, but I doubt Frank Weber wants to hire the guy who can barely keep his own shop running. Don't sell yourself short, Bob. You know more about mechanical systems than you give yourself credit. 4. Before Bob could respond, the distinctive rumble of a high-performance engine announced another visitor. Through the open bay door, they watched a pristine Ford F-250 pull into the parking area, its chrome bumpers gleaming in the afternoon sun. Ken Murphy stepped out of the truck, adjusting his expensive sunglasses and surveying Bob's modest operation with undisguised amusement. Well, well, Diane Cox gracing the competition with her presence. Ken's voice carried the confident tone of someone accustomed to being the most successful person in any room. At 45, he had built Murphy's Premium Motors into the dominant automotive business in the region through a combination of aggressive marketing and strategic partnerships with major manufacturers. His clothing, from his pressed khakis to his company logo polo shirt, projected an image of professional success that contrasted sharply with Bob's grease-stained coveralls. "Hello, Ken," Diane replied coolly. "Just checking on some parts orders." Ken's attention shifted to Bob, who had moved to stand beside his workbench in a defensive posture. The two men had little in common beyond their shared profession, and their interactions typically remained cordial but distant. "Bob, I hear you're still struggling to keep this place afloat. Maybe it's time to consider my offer about coming to work for a real operation." The offer Ken referenced had been made several times over the past year, always with the implication that Bob's independent garage represented some kind of failure. Working for Murphy's Premium Motors would provide steady income and job security, but it would also mean abandoning his dreams of specializing in restoration work. "Thanks, but I'm managing fine." Ken's smile suggested he disagreed with that assessment. "Well, if you change your mind, I could always use another mechanic, especially with all the extra work I'm picking up lately." "Extra work?" Diane asked. "Oh, didn't you hear? I just finished working on Frank Weber's Sherman tank. Poor old guy had been throwing money at that piece of junk for weeks, hiring every shade tree mechanic in Arkansas to look at it." Bob's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. The casual dismissal of the other mechanics stung, but Ken's characterization of the Sherman as a piece of junk hit even harder. To Bob, military vehicles like the Sherman represented engineering marvels, machines that had served crucial roles in history and deserved respect regardless of their current condition. "Were you able to fix it?" Bob asked, trying to keep his voice level. Ken's expression shifted to something approaching smug satisfaction. "I spent 3 hours going through that engine bay yesterday, checked everything twice. The problem isn't mechanical, it's fundamental. That tank has been sitting in Frank's barn for 30 years, and some things just can't be brought back to life. So you're saying it's unfixable?" "I'm saying any mechanic worth his certification would reach the same conclusion. The electrical system is shot, the fuel delivery is compromised, and half the engine components are corroded beyond repair. It would cost more to restore that tank than Frank paid for it in the first place." Diane glanced between the two men, sensing tension building beneath their polite conversation. She had known both Bob and Ken for years, and their fundamental differences in approach and personality were becoming increasingly apparent. "That seems like a definitive diagnosis," she said carefully. Ken nodded confidently. "When you've been in this business as long as I have, you learn to recognize lost causes. That tank is nothing more than an expensive lawn ornament now." Bob felt heat rising in his face, but forced himself to remain calm. Ken's certainty about the Sherman's condition rankled him, particularly because it dismissed possibilities that a more thorough understanding of military vehicle systems might reveal. Sherman tanks had been designed for field repair under combat conditions, which meant their systems were often more robust and recoverable than civilian vehicles. "Maybe the right approach just hasn't been tried yet," Bob said quietly. Ken's eyebrows rose in apparent amusement. "The right approach? Bob, I've got certifications from 3 major manufacturers and 20 years of experience. If I can't fix it, I'm pretty confident it can't be fixed. Different vehicles require different expertise. Are you suggesting you might succeed where I failed?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications about professional competence and local reputation. Diane watched the exchange with growing concern, recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond casual discussion into something more personal. Bob hesitated, aware that his answer could have consequences beyond this moment. Challenging Ken Murphy's professional judgment in front of Diane Cox would inevitably become public knowledge in a town the size of Ridgefield. If he failed to back up his implied confidence, his reputation would suffer damage he could ill afford. I'm saying maybe it deserves another look from someone who specializes in that type of machinery. Ken's smile became predatory. Specializes? Bob, you fix pickup trucks and lawnmowers. What could you possibly know about military vehicles that I don't? Bob's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. More than you might think. Really? Well, this is interesting. Ken glanced at Diane, then back at Bob. Tell you what, since you seem so confident, why don't we make this interesting? I'll bet you $5,000 that you can't get that tank running by the Veterans Day ceremony. The sum represented more money than Bob typically earned in 2 months, and everyone in the garage understood the significance of the wager. Ken was effectively challenging not just Bob's mechanical abilities, but his financial stability and professional credibility. $5,000, Bob repeated. That's right. Put your money where your mouth is. Either you can fix what I couldn't, or you admit that some jobs are beyond your capabilities. Diane stepped forward, concern evident in her voice. Ken, that seems excessive. Not at all. Bob's the one claiming he might succeed where certified professionals have failed. I'm just offering him the opportunity to prove it. Bob's mind raced through the implications of accepting such a bet. $5,000 would solve most of his immediate financial problems, but losing that amount would probably force him to close the garage permanently. More importantly, failure would confirm every criticism Ken and others had made about his competence and business prospects. Yet the prospect of working on a Sherman tank, of applying the knowledge he had accumulated through years of study, proved almost irresistible. This represented exactly the kind of opportunity he had hoped for, even if it came wrapped in a public challenge that could destroy his career. What are the terms? Bob asked finally. Ken's smile widened. Simple. The tank has to be running in time for the Veterans Day ceremony. That gives you exactly 2 weeks. If it starts and operates under its own power during the demonstration, you win. If not, you pay me $5,000 and admit publicly that you were wrong to question my diagnosis. And if I win, then you get the $5,000, plus I'll personally recommend your services to every customer who asks about complex mechanical work. Bob looked at Diane, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, clearly advising against accepting the wager. The rational part of his mind agreed with her assessment. The risk far outweighed any potential reward, especially given the financial precariousness of his situation. But another part of him, the part that had spent countless hours studying tank manuals and dreaming of working on military vehicles, whispered that this might be his only chance to prove that his knowledge had real value. "All right," Bob said quietly. "I accept." Ken's expression showed genuine surprise that Bob had actually agreed to the bet. He had expected the younger mechanic to back down when confronted with serious financial consequences. "Excellent. Diane can witness the agreement." Ken extended his hand. "May the best mechanic win." As they shook hands, Bob felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. In 2 weeks, he would either vindicate his passion for military vehicles or confirm everyone's suspicions that he was an impractical dreamer, unsuited for serious mechanical work. The die was cast, and there was no turning back now. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. After Ken Murphy's truck disappeared down the gravel road, leaving only a cloud of dust and the echo of his confident laughter, Bob stood in his garage doorway, feeling the full weight of what he had just committed to. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Diane Cox finally spoke. "Bob, what were you thinking? $5,000. He turned back into the garage, moving toward his workbench where his collection of technical manuals sat in their familiar stack. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the Sherman Maintenance Guide, its pages worn soft from countless readings. "I was thinking that Ken Murphy doesn't know everything about every engine that exists. But $5,000, Bob, that's more than your monthly rent and utilities combined." Bob opened the manual to a detailed diagram of the M4 Sherman's engine compartment, his finger tracing the intricate network of fuel lines and electrical connections. For 3 years, he had studied these systems in theoretical detail, memorizing specifications and maintenance procedures that most mechanics would never encounter. "What if I told you I've been preparing for this opportunity my entire adult life?" Diane pulled up a folding chair, settling beside him as he flipped through pages of technical specifications. The garage fell quiet, except for the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of traffic on Highway 16. "Tell me." Bob's expression grew distant as he considered where to begin. His fascination with military vehicles had started in childhood, sparked by war documentaries and museums visits with his grandfather. But what began as casual interest had evolved into something approaching obsession over the years. When I was 12, my grandfather took me to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. They had a U-505 submarine and a Sherman tank on display. While other kids were running around looking at the space exhibits, I spent 4 hours studying that tank. He pulled out a second manual, this one focusing specifically on electrical systems. The margins were filled with handwritten notes in his careful script, cross-references to online forum discussions and restoration project reports. The docent noticed me taking notes and started explaining how the engine worked. By the time we left, he'd given me 3 technical manuals and told me I should consider becoming a mechanical engineer. "Why didn't you?" Bob's smile carried a hint of old disappointment. "College costs money. My family needed me working right after high school, so I learned automotive repair and told myself it was close enough." Diane nodded, understanding the economic realities that shaped many young people's choices in small Arkansas towns. College remained an expensive luxury that families like the Prices couldn't easily afford. But you kept studying tanks anyway. Every chance I got, I joined online restoration forums, corresponded with museum curators, even drove to military vehicle shows whenever I could afford the gas. Last year, I helped a collector in Memphis diagnose a fuel pump problem on his M3 half-track. Bob reached under his workbench and withdrew a cardboard box filled with correspondence. Letters from restoration experts, printouts of forum discussions, and photographs of various military vehicles created an impressive archive of specialized knowledge. "Bob, I had no idea you were this serious about it. Most people don't. They see a guy fixing cars in a rundown garage and assume that's all I'm capable of." His voice carried no bitterness, just a matter-of-fact acceptance of how others perceived him. "Ken Murphy isn't the first person to underestimate what I know about mechanical systems." The afternoon sun slanted through the garage's single window, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Diane picked up one of the letters, noting the letterhead from the National Museum of World War II. "Dr. Eleanor Hayes, Curator of Military Technology. She's asking for your input on an engine restoration project. Eleanor and I have been corresponding for 2 years. She sends me technical questions that stump her regular restoration team. And I research solutions using period-appropriate methods. Diane read the letter's conclusion aloud. Your insights into fuel system modifications have been invaluable to our M4A3E8 restoration. Please consider visiting New Orleans to consult on our upcoming Sherman Firefly project. She looked up at Bob with newfound respect. They want to hire you as a consultant. I've never had the money to travel that far for what might be a few days of work, but this bet with Ken changes everything. Bob closed the manual and leaned back against his workbench. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer as the initial adrenaline of accepting the challenge faded. He possessed theoretical knowledge that might be sufficient to diagnose the Sherman's problems, but translating that knowledge into practical results under public scrutiny represented an entirely different challenge. If I can actually fix Frank Webber's tank, it proves my expertise has real value. If I fail, you lose everything. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced another visitor. Through the garage door, they watched a dusty pickup truck pull into the parking area. Frank Webber climbed out slowly, his 72 years evident in the careful way he moved. As the original owner of the problematic Sherman tank, his arrival felt almost inevitable. Afternoon, folks. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Frank Webber commanded respect throughout Ridgefield as both a successful businessman and decorated World War II veteran. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen considerable hardship but maintained an essentially optimistic outlook on life. He moved with the deliberate pace of age, but still projected an aura of quiet authority. "Mr. Webber, good to see you," Bob replied, suddenly conscious of his grease-stained appearance. "Diane was just telling me about your tank." Frank's expression darkened slightly. "That tank is becoming the most expensive lawn ornament in Arkansas. I've thrown more money at that engine than I spent on my first 3 cars combined. What exactly have the other mechanics tried?" Frank pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, consulting notes written in shaky handwriting. "Tommy Martinez replaced the spark plugs and checked the ignition timing. The specialist from Little Rock rebuilt the carburetor and tested the fuel pump. Ken Murphy went through the entire electrical system yesterday." Bob nodded, filing away each detail. The progression of attempted repairs suggested a logical diagnostic approach, but military vehicle systems often required specialized knowledge that civilian mechanics might not possess. And none of them could get it to turn over? "Oh, it turns over fine. Engine cranks like it wants to start, but it won't catch and run. Soon as you release the starter, it dies." This detail immediately narrowed the range of possible problems. An engine that cranked but wouldn't run typically suffered from fuel delivery issues, ignition timing problems, or compression loss. However, Sherman tanks used different fuel and ignition systems than civilian vehicles, which might explain why conventional diagnostic approaches had failed. "Mr. Webber, would you mind if I took a look at it?" Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You interested in working on military vehicles?" "I've been studying tank restoration for years, mostly theoretical knowledge, but I understand the systems pretty well." Theoretical knowledge. Frank's tone suggested skepticism about the value of book learning versus practical experience. Diane intervened before Bob could respond. "Frank, you should see his technical library. He's got manuals and correspondence with museum curators all over the country." Frank studied Bob with renewed interest. "Is that so? What can you tell me about M4A1 fuel systems?" Bob straightened, recognizing this as a test of his knowledge. The M4A1 used a mechanical fuel pump driven off the engine camshaft, feeding a single-barrel carburetor. The fuel tank was mounted in the right rear sponson, with the fuel line running forward along the right side of the hull. And the electrical system, 12-volt system with a generator rather than an alternator. The starter was a Bendix drive unit, and ignition was provided by a conventional distributor with mechanical advance. Frank's expression showed growing respect for Bob's technical knowledge. You really have been studying these machines. What year was your tank manufactured? 1943, built by the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio. Bob nodded, accessing specific information about production variations. Lima-built tanks from 1943 had several unique characteristics. They used a slightly different carburetor mounting system and had modifications to the fuel line routing that weren't documented in the standard manuals. I'll be damned. You do know what you're talking about. The three of them stood in the garage as afternoon shadows lengthened, the weight of potential opportunity settling around them. Bob sensed that this conversation might determine whether Frank would allow him to work on the tank, regardless of Ken Murphy's confident dismissal. Mr. Weber, I heard Ken Murphy examined your tank yesterday. Frank's expression grew sour. Ken spent 3 hours telling me everything that was wrong with it and why it couldn't be fixed. According to him, I should donate it to a museum as a static display and forget about getting it running. But you don't want to give up on it. Son, that tank represents something important. My unit used M4A1s in the Pacific, and I've got personal reasons for wanting this one operational for the ceremony. Bob felt the weight of that statement. For Frank Weber, the Sherman wasn't just a mechanical puzzle to be solved, but a connection to experiences and memories that deserved honor and respect. I'd like to try, sir. I can't guarantee success, but I believe I can bring a different perspective to the problem. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying Bob's face for signs of competence and sincerity. Ken Murphy thinks you're wasting your time. He says any mechanic worth his certification would reach the same conclusion he did. Ken Murphy has never worked on a Sherman tank before yesterday. And you have. Bob hesitated, aware that his answer would be scrutinized carefully. Not hands-on, no. But I've studied these systems extensively, and I understand the engineering principles involved. Sometimes fresh eyes can spot problems that previous mechanics missed. Or sometimes inexperience leads to expensive mistakes. Diane stepped forward, sensing that Frank needed additional reassurance about Bob's capabilities. Frank, I've known Bob for 3 years. He's methodical, careful, and he doesn't take on jobs he can't handle. Frank nodded slowly. What would you want to charge for a diagnostic examination? Bob considered the question carefully. His immediate instinct was to quote his standard hourly rate, but this represented something more significant than routine. Repair work. Success could establish his reputation in military vehicle restoration, while failure would confirm Ken Murphy's assessment of his limitations. Nothing for the initial examination. If I can identify the problem and you want me to proceed with repairs, we can discuss costs then. That seems fair. When would you want to look at it? Tomorrow morning, if that works for you. Frank extended his weathered hand. Deal. Tanks in my barn on County Road 47, about 5 miles east of town. I'll expect you around 8 o'clock. As they shook hands, Bob felt the weight of commitment settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow morning, he would finally have the opportunity to apply years of theoretical study to an actual Sherman tank. The prospect excited and terrified him in equal measure. After Frank departed, Diane remained in the garage as evening shadows crept across the concrete floor. Bob busied himself organizing his technical manuals, selecting the ones most relevant to M4A1 systems and maintenance procedures. You realize what you've gotten yourself into? She asked quietly. A chance to prove that my knowledge is worth something, or a chance to lose everything if you're wrong about your abilities. Bob looked up from his preparations, meeting her concerned gaze. "Diane, I've spent 10 years fixing other people's cars and dreaming about working on something that actually matters to me. This might be my only opportunity to find out if those dreams have any basis in reality. And if they don't?" He considered the question seriously. The possibility of failure loomed large, but so did the potential consequences of never trying at all. "Then at least I'll know where I stand." Diane gathered her purse and moved toward the door. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you're brave. For trying, or stupid, maybe both, but Ken Murphy has been getting away with being the big fish in this small pond for too long. Someone should challenge his assumptions." After she left, Bob remained in the garage as darkness settled over Ridgefield. He spread his technical manuals across his workbench, creating a comprehensive reference library for tomorrow's examination. Sherman tank fuel systems, electrical schematics, and engine specifications filled his workspace like pieces of a complex puzzle waiting to be assembled. His phone rang, displaying his girlfriend Cindy's number. She worked the evening shift at Ridgefield Community Hospital and usually called during her break. "Hey, how was your day?" "Interesting. I just agreed to bet Ken Murphy $5,000 that I can fix Frank Weber's Sherman tank." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Bob wondered if the call had dropped. "Cindy, you still there? $5,000, Bob? We don't have $5,000. "I know. Then why would you make that bet?" Bob stared at the technical manual spread across his workbench, each page representing hours of study and accumulated knowledge that had never been put to practical use. Because sometimes you have to risk everything to prove what you're capable of, and sometimes you lose everything and have to start over with nothing. Her concern was justified, Bob knew. Their relationship had survived 3 years of his struggling, business and uncertain income, but a $5,000 loss would create financial problems that might prove insurmountable. "I'm going to examine the tank tomorrow morning. Once I see what I'm dealing with, I'll have a better sense of whether this is feasible. Promise me you'll be honest about your limitations. Don't let pride push you into attempting something beyond your abilities, I promise." After the call ended, Bob continued studying his manuals late into the evening. Tomorrow would determine whether years of theoretical preparation could translate into practical success, or whether Ken Murphy's confident dismissal of his capabilities had been accurate all along. The stakes were higher than money now. This was about proving to himself and his community that passionate expertise, even self-taught, could compete with formal credentials and established reputation. As midnight approached, Bob finally closed his manuals and prepared for what might be the most important day of his professional life. In 8 hours, he would face the Sherman tank that had defeated 3 experienced mechanics, armed with nothing but theoretical knowledge and an unshakable belief that he understood these machines better than anyone else in Ridgefield. Whether that belief was justified would be determined soon enough. Bob's alarm clock shattered the pre-dawn silence at 6:30, though he had been awake for the better part of an hour, staring at the ceiling and mentally rehearsing diagnostic procedures. His small apartment above the garage felt cramped and stifling as nervous energy coursed through him. He dressed carefully, selecting his cleanest work clothes and ensuring his tool bag contained everything he might need for the initial examination. The drive to Frank Weber's property took him through the heart of Ridgefield's agricultural district, where sprawling farmland stretched toward the distant Arkansas River. Morning mist clung to the fields, creating an ethereal landscape that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Today, Bob barely noticed the scenery, his mind focused entirely on the challenge waiting in Frank's barn. County Road 47 wound through rolling hills dotted with cattle and old homesteads. Frank's property announced itself with a weathered mailbox, bearing his name in faded letters. Bob turned into a gravel driveway that led to a modest farmhouse surrounded by several outbuildings, including a large metal barn that presumably housed the Sherman tank. Frank emerged from the house as Bob parked, his truck moving with the deliberate gait of someone whose joints protested against morning activity. He wore faded overalls and a John Deere cap that had seen better decades, presenting the image of a man comfortable with rural life and manual work. "You're punctual, son. I appreciate that in a man." Bob climbed out of his truck and retrieved his tool bag, noting the way Frank studied his movements and equipment with the critical eye of someone evaluating competence. "Morning, Mr. Weber. I brought everything I thought I might need for the examination." "Good. Tank's in the barn. Fair warning, she's not much to look at after 30 years of sitting idle." They walked across the farmyard, their boots crunching. On gravel scattered with fallen leaves, the barn's metal siding showed rust stains and weather damage, but the structure appeared sound. Frank worked the heavy sliding door open, revealing the interior illuminated by several hanging fluorescent fixtures. Bob's breath caught in his throat as he saw the Sherman tank for the first time. The M4A1 sat in the center of the barn like a sleeping giant, its angular silhouette instantly recognizable despite decades of neglect. Rust had claimed portions of the hull where protective paint had failed, and dust covered every surface thick enough to write messages in. Yet beneath the accumulated grime, Bob could see the essential lines and proportions that marked this as a genuine piece of military history. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Frank said, noting Bob's obvious fascination. Bob approached the tank slowly, his trained eye cataloging details that confirmed its authenticity and assessed its condition. The track system appeared intact, though individual rubber pads showed cracking from age and weather exposure. The main gun had been deactivated according to federal regulations, but the turret mechanism looked functional. "Lima Locomotive Works, serial number visible on the rear hull plate," Bob observed, circling the vehicle. "Gun shield shows Pacific Theater modifications, probably added during depot maintenance in 1944. Frank's eyebrows rose. "How could you possibly know that from looking at external details?" Bob pointed to subtle differences in welding patterns and equipment mounting points. Different manufacturers used slightly different techniques for field modifications. Lima's welders had a distinctive approach to reinforcing the gun shield mounting points. "You really have studied these machines." Moving to the rear of the tank, Bob examined the engine compartment access panels. Previous mechanics had clearly been working here recently. Fresh tool marks were visible around several bolts, and some panels showed signs of repeated removal and reinstallation. "Mind if I open her up and take a look inside?" Frank nodded. "Go ahead, just be careful. Some of those panel latches are pretty corroded." Bob set his tool bag on a nearby workbench and selected a combination wrench that fit the engine compartment. Fasteners. The first panel came away easily, revealing the rear section of the Ford GAA V8 engine that powered most M4A1 Shermans. Despite 3 decades of inactivity, the engine bay looked remarkably clean, suggesting that previous mechanics had already performed considerable cleaning and inspection work. "Ken Murphy and the others already went through all this," Frank said, watching Bob's methodical examination. "They checked the oil, tested compression, and verified that all the electrical connections were solid." Bob nodded absently, his attention focused on details that might have escaped notice during previous inspections. Sherman tank engines differed from civilian automotive power plants in several crucial ways, and these differences sometimes created diagnostic challenges for mechanics unfamiliar with military specifications. The Ford GAA was a remarkable piece of engineering. A 500 cubic inch V8, originally designed for aircraft use, but adapted for tank service. Unlike civilian engines, it featured magnesium construction for weight savings and used a different oiling system designed to function during extreme vehicle angles encountered in combat. "Mr. Weber, do you have the maintenance logs for this tank?" Frank disappeared into a corner of the barn and returned with a leather portfolio thick with yellowed documents. "Everything I could find. Previous owner kept meticulous records until about 1975. Then it just sat in his barn until I bought it last year." Bob accepted the portfolio and began examining entries written in various hands over 3 decades. The early logs detailed routine, maintenance performed according to military procedures, but later entries showed increasing gaps and eventual abandonment of systematic care. Last recorded engine operation was August 1976, Bob noted, reading from the final entry. Owner noted that the engine was running rough and decided to store the vehicle rather than risk damage. That was almost 50 years ago. Bob continued reading, absorbing information about parts replacements, fuel system maintenance, and electrical work performed during the tank's civilian ownership. One entry caught his attention. A note about fuel system modifications made in 1974 to accommodate changes in gasoline formulation. "This is interesting. Previous owner modified the carburetor jetting to compensate for unlidded gasoline requirements. Is that significant?" Bob studied the entry more carefully, cross-referencing it with his knowledge of Sherman fuel system specifications. Military vehicles of the 1940s had been designed to operate on different fuel than modern civilian gasoline, and modifications to accommodate these changes sometimes created unexpected problems. Possibly. Sherman tanks were originally designed to run on 80-octane aviation gasoline, which had different characteristics than modern automotive fuel. Carburetor modifications might have created fuel delivery problems that wouldn't be obvious to mechanics unfamiliar with the original specifications. Frank watched as Bob moved systematically around the engine compartment, examining components with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what he was looking for. Unlike previous mechanics who had approached the task with standard automotive diagnostic procedures, Bob seemed to be following a different methodology entirely. "What are you thinking?" Bob didn't answer immediately, instead removing additional access panels to examine the fuel delivery system. The mechanical fuel pump appeared to have been recently rebuilt, and fuel lines showed signs of recent replacement. However, something about the carburetor installation looked subtly wrong to his trained eye. "The carburetor mounting angle is incorrect," he said finally. "What do you mean?" Bob pointed to the carburetor throat, which tilted slightly forward from the vertical position specified in Sherman maintenance manuals. Military carburetors were designed to operate at a specific angle to ensure proper fuel flow during vehicle operation on steep terrain. "This one has been rotated about 5 degrees from the correct position." Frank peered at the component Bob indicated, but the significance of the angular difference wasn't immediately apparent to him. Would that prevent the engine from running? It might cause fuel starvation during startup. The float bowl level would be affected, which could prevent the engine from drawing enough fuel to maintain operation after the starter disengages. Bob reached into his tool bag and withdrew a small carpenter's level, carefully measuring the carburetor's position against the specifications he had memorized from technical manuals. The deviation was exactly as he had suspected. Enough to affect fuel delivery, but subtle enough that mechanics unfamiliar with military specifications might not notice. That's definitely not right. Question is whether correcting it will solve the starting problem. Frank's expression showed growing excitement as he recognized that Bob had identified something previous mechanics had missed entirely. How long would it take to fix? Maybe an hour to properly realign the carburetor and adjust the float level. After that, we'd need to test the engine to see if there are additional problems. Bob continued his examination, checking ignition timing and electrical connections while developing a mental picture of the tank's overall condition. The engine appeared mechanically sound despite its long period of inactivity, and most of the supporting systems showed evidence of recent maintenance and repair. Mr. Weber, this tank is in much better condition than Ken Murphy suggested. Most of the work needed is adjustment and calibration rather than major component replacement. So, you think you can get it running? Bob hesitated, aware that overconfidence at this stage could lead to costly mistakes later. I think I can identify and correct the problems that are preventing it from starting. Whether that translates to reliable operation for the ceremony depends on what we find during testing. Frank nodded, appreciating Bob's cautious optimism. What would you need to proceed with the repairs? Access to the tank for several days, and your permission to make adjustments that might affect its value as a collector's item. Son, this tank isn't valuable sitting in my barn looking pretty. Its value comes from honoring the men who operated machines like this in combat. If you can make it run again, you have my complete authorization to do whatever needs doing. Bob felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders. Frank Weber wasn't just asking him to repair a mechanical device, but to restore a piece of living history that connected the present to sacrifices made by previous generations. I'll need to bring some specialized tools from my shop and possibly order a few parts if we find components that can't be repaired, whatever it costs, within reason. They spent another hour going over the tank's systems while Bob explained his diagnostic findings and proposed repair approach. Frank's questions revealed a deeper understanding of mechanical principles than his modest appearance suggested. And Bob realized he was dealing with someone who appreciated both the technical complexity and historical significance of the restoration project. As they prepared to leave the barn, Frank paused beside the tank's front slope armor. Bob, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Why is this so important to you? Most young men your age are interested in computers and video games, not old military equipment. Bob considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would help Frank understand his motivations and commitment to the project. When I was growing up, my grandfather used to tell me stories about the war. He served in the Pacific with the 1st Marine Division, and he talked about how Sherman tanks saved his life more than once during island fighting. Bob's voice took on a more personal tone as he continued. He said those tanks represented the difference between going home to family and dying on some nameless beach thousands of miles from Arkansas. To him, they weren't just machines. They were symbols of American industrial capability and the courage of the men who operated them. Frank nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning behind Bob's passion for military vehicle restoration. My grandfather died when I was 16, but he made me promise to never forget what his generation sacrificed. Working on tanks like this feels like keeping that promise. That's a hell of a good reason, son. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Bob felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his regular automotive repair work. This project represented more than just a mechanical challenge or a way to win Ken Murphy's bet. It was an opportunity to honor history and demonstrate that passionate dedication could achieve results that formal credentials alone might not. Frank stopped at Bob's truck as he prepared to leave. When can you start the actual repair work? Tomorrow morning, if that works for you. I'll need today to gather tools and research some specific procedures. Sounds good. And Bob? Yes, sir? I've got a good feeling about this. Ken Murphy might know how to fix modern cars, but you understand what this tank means beyond just nuts and bolts. Driving back toward Ridgefield, Bob felt cautiously optimistic about his chances of success. The Sherman's problems appeared to be exactly the kind of issues the deep knowledge of military vehicle specifications could solve. Subtle engineering differences that conventional automotive experience might overlook. The real test would come tomorrow, when theoretical knowledge would finally meet practical application in Frank Weber's barn. Bob had identified what he believed were the root causes of the starting problems: but proving his diagnosis correct would require careful work and perhaps a small measure of luck. As the town of Ridgefield came into view ahead, Bob allowed himself to imagine what success might mean for his future. A working Sherman tank would validate years of self-directed study and potentially open doors to the kind of specialized restoration work he had always dreamed of pursuing. But first, he had to prove that a small-town mechanic with big dreams could succeed where established professionals had failed. Word traveled fast in Ridgefield. By Tuesday afternoon, half the town knew about Bob Price's audacious bet with Ken Murphy, and opinions were sharply divided. The regulars at Betty Lou's diner huddled over coffee cups, debating whether the young mechanic was brave or foolish to challenge the county's most successful automotive dealer. Bob tried to ignore the whispered conversations and sideways glances as he gathered supplies for the Sherman restoration. His first stop was Cox Auto Parts, where Diane had pulled together an assortment of specialized tools and gaskets that might prove useful during the carburetor realignment process. "How'd the examination go yesterday?" she asked, noting the determined expression on Bob's face. "Better than expected. I think I found the primary problem, maybe a secondary issue as well." Diane's eyes brightened with curiosity. "What kind of problems?" Bob leaned against the parts counter, grateful for someone who took his mechanical insights seriously. "The carburetor mounting angle is wrong, which affects fuel delivery during startup. Plus, there's evidence of modifications made in the 1970s. That might be causing compatibility issues with modern gasoline. Sounds fixable. Should be if my diagnosis is correct. The real challenge will be fine-tuning everything to work together properly." The bell above the door chimed, announcing another customer. Drew Bailey entered, his Murphy's Premium Motors. Uniform, immediately recognizable. At 28, Drew represented Ken Murphy's investment in younger talent, though his mechanical skills remained largely untested on complex problems. "Hey Bob, heard you're taking on Frank Weber's tank project." Bob nodded cautiously, unsure whether Drew's visit was friendly or adversarial. The two men had maintained a cordial relationship despite working for competing businesses, but the current situation might strain that professional courtesy. "Ken asked me to swing by and see if you needed any technical support. He's got access to diagnostic equipment that might be helpful for electrical system testing." The offer surprised Bob, who had expected Ken to remain aloof during the repair process. "That's generous of him." Drew shifted uncomfortably. "To be honest, Ken's pretty confident you won't succeed. He figures offering to help makes him look magnanimous when you eventually give up." Diane frowned at the implication. "That seems unnecessarily condescending. Ken's been the go-to mechanic in this county for 20 years. Having his expertise questioned by someone half his age doesn't sit well with him." Bob appreciated Drew's honesty, even if the underlying message wasn't particularly encouraging. "Tell Ken, I appreciate the offer, but I've got everything I need for now." "Fair enough. Good luck with the project." After Drew departed, Diane helped. Bob loaded his truck with parts and supplies. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he secured everything in the truck bed. "You nervous about tomorrow?" Bob considered the question honestly. "Terrified would be more accurate. If I'm wrong about the carburetor angle, I'll have to start over with a completely different diagnostic approach. And if you're right, then I move one step closer to either vindication or spectacular failure." The drive to Frank Weber's farm took Bob through Ridgefield's modest downtown district, where several people waved from sidewalks and storefronts. The attention made him uncomfortable. He preferred working in anonymity rather than serving as the subject of public speculation. Frank met him at the barn with obvious enthusiasm, eager to see whether Bob's confident diagnosis would translate into practical results. They spent a few minutes reviewing the planned repair procedures before Bob began the delicate process of removing the carburetor from its mounting bracket. "How long has it been since you worked on something this old?" Frank asked, watching Bob's careful movements around the engine bay. "This is actually my first hands-on experience with a military vehicle. Most of my knowledge comes from technical manuals and correspondence with restoration experts." Frank's expression showed mild alarm. "You mean you've never actually repaired a tank before?" Bob paused in his work, recognizing that Frank deserved complete honesty about his experience level. "No, sir, I haven't. But the mechanical principles are the same as civilian vehicles, just applied to different specifications and tolerances." "That's not exactly reassuring. Mr. Weber, every expert started with their first project. The question is whether they approached it with sufficient preparation and respect for the complexity involved." Frank nodded slowly, apparently deciding to trust Bob's methodical approach despite his lack of direct experience. "Well, you certainly seem to know what you're talking about." Bob carefully lifted the carburetor from its mounting position, noting the weight and complexity of the component. Military carburetors were built to much higher standards than civilian equivalents, with precision machining and robust construction designed to function under combat conditions. Setting the carburetor on his workbench, Bob began the process of measuring its mounting angle against the specifications he had memorized from technical documentation. A precision protractor confirmed his initial assessment. The carburetor had been installed approximately 5 degrees off the correct position. "There's the problem," he said, showing Frank the angular measurement. "This deviation affects the float bowl level, which controls fuel delivery to the engine. How could 3 other mechanics miss something that obvious?" Bob considered his response carefully, not wanting to criticize his competitors while still explaining the diagnostic oversight. Military vehicle specifications aren't covered in standard automotive training. Most mechanics would assume that if the carburetor was properly bolted in place, the mounting angle was correct. The process of correcting the carburetor position required careful measurement and adjustment of the mounting bracket. Bob worked slowly, double-checking each modification against his technical references to ensure accuracy. Frank watched with growing respect for the young mechanic's methodical approach. "You're being awfully careful about this. Military carburetors were precision instruments. Small errors in installation can create major performance problems." As Bob worked, Frank shared stories about his wartime experiences with Sherman tanks, providing context that helped illuminate the importance of proper maintenance and repair procedures. The tanks had operated under extreme conditions, often hundreds of miles from supply depots, which meant field repairs needed to be both accurate and durable. "We had one tank in our unit that kept losing power during combat operations. Turned out the mechanic had installed the air cleaner backwards, which restricted airflow to the carburetor. Did you fix it in the field?" "Had to. Couldn't afford to have a tank out of action during an offensive operation. Our sergeant figured out the problem and corrected it using nothing but basic hand tools." Bob found these anecdotes fascinating, providing insight into the practical challenges faced by military mechanics working under combat conditions. The stories also reinforced his belief that Sherman tanks were robust machines, capable of reliable operation when properly maintained. By late afternoon, Bob had successfully realigned the carburetor and adjusted the float level according to military specifications. The component now sat at the correct angle, which should ensure proper fuel delivery during engine startup and operation. "Ready to test it?" Frank asked, anticipation evident in his voice. Bob nodded, though he felt considerable anxiety about this crucial moment. If his diagnosis was correct, the engine should start and run smoothly. If he was wrong, they would be back to square one with no clear path forward. Frank climbed into the driver's position while Bob made final checks of the fuel and electrical systems. Everything appeared properly connected and adjusted according To his understanding of Sherman tank specifications, fuel valve open, ignition switch on, Frank called out, following the startup procedure outlined in the operator's manual. Engage the starter. The Ford GAA engine turned over with the distinctive sound of a large displacement V8 cranking slowly. For several seconds, nothing happened beyond the mechanical noise of the starter motor. Then, suddenly, the engine caught and rumbled to life with a deep, powerful note that filled the barn with sound. Frank's whoop of excitement was barely audible over the engine noise. Bob felt a surge of relief and satisfaction as the tank's power plant settled into a steady idle, running smoothly without the hesitation or rough operation that had plagued previous attempts. "She's running!" Frank shouted over the engine noise. Bob monitored the various gauges and indicators, noting that oil pressure and coolant temperature were within normal ranges. The engine's operation seemed stable and consistent, suggesting that the carburetor realignment had indeed resolved the primary starting problem. After several minutes of operation, Frank shut down the engine and climbed out of the driver's position with a broad grin on his weathered face. "Son, that's the sweetest sound I've heard in 30 years. Bob allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before returning to his systematic approach. "The engine's running, but we need to do more testing to ensure reliable operation. This was just the first step." "What kind of testing?" "Drive system engagement, steering responsiveness, electrical system performance under load. A tank that starts but won't move isn't much use for a ceremony." Frank nodded, understanding that successful engine startup represented only the beginning of the restoration process. "How long do you think the complete testing will take?" "Several days, maybe a week if we encounter additional problems. Military vehicles have complex interconnected systems that need to function together properly." As they secured the barn for the evening, Frank's enthusiasm was infectious. Bob found himself caught up in the excitement of success, though he tried to maintain realistic expectations about the challenges that might still emerge. "Bob, I owe you an apology. When you first offered to work on this tank, I had serious doubts about your ability to succeed where others had failed. I understand your skepticism. I'm not exactly the obvious choice for this kind of project." "Maybe not obvious, but definitely the right choice. You approached this problem differently than the other mechanics, and that made all the difference." Driving back toward Ridgefield, Bob reflected on the day's accomplishments and remaining challenges. Getting the engine to start represented a significant milestone, but Ken Murphy's bet required the tank to be fully operational for the Veterans Day ceremony. Complete restoration would demand sustained effort and careful attention to numerous additional systems. The real test of his expertise lay ahead, but today's success provided compelling evidence that his years of theoretical study could indeed translate into practical results. Bob Price was no longer just a struggling small-town mechanic with an unusual hobby. He was becoming a legitimate military vehicle restoration specialist. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he moved from engine repair to comprehensive system testing. Each successful step brought him closer to either professional vindication or public failure, with $5,000 and his entire future hanging in the balance. The stakes had never been higher, but for the first time since accepting Ken Murphy's bet, Bob felt genuinely confident that he might actually succeed. As Ridgefield streetlights came into view ahead, Bob allowed himself to imagine what victory might mean for his career prospects and personal dreams. Success with Frank Weber's Sherman tank could transform his struggling repair business into something approaching the military vehicle restoration work he had always wanted to pursue. But first, he had to prove that today's engine startup was just the beginning, not a lucky accident that couldn't be repeated when it mattered most. News of the Sherman tank's successful engine startup reached Ken Murphy's garage before Bob had even made it home. Drew Bailey, following his boss's instructions to monitor the situation, had driven past Frank Weber's farm and heard the unmistakable rumble of the Ford GAA engine echoing from the barn. By Wednesday morning, Murphy's premium motors buzzed with uncomfortable discussions about the implications of Bob's initial success. Ken stood in his spotless service bay, surrounded by the latest diagnostic equipment and manufacturer certifications that decorated his office walls. His confident demeanor from earlier in the week had given way to something approaching concern as he processed the unexpected development. "You're sure it was actually running?" he asked Drew for the third time. "Positive. Deep V8 rumble, steady idle, no misfiring or rough operation. Sounded like a healthy engine to me." Ken's jaw tightened as he considered the possibility that his dismissive assessment of the tank's condition might have been premature. Getting it to start once doesn't mean anything. Military vehicles have dozens of systems that need to work together properly. Tommy Rodriguez, the youngest mechanic at Murphy's garage, looked up from the brake job he was completing. "Still, if Bob figured out something we missed, that's pretty impressive." "We didn't miss anything," Ken snapped. "I spent 3 hours going through every system on that tank. The problems go way beyond whatever quick fix Bob might have stumbled onto." Drew exchanged a glance with Tommy, both men recognizing that Ken's certainty was being challenged by developments he hadn't anticipated. The possibility that a struggling independent mechanic might succeed where Murphy's premium motors had failed threatened more than just Ken's $5,000 bet. Meanwhile, at Frank Weber's farm, Bob arrived early to begin the next phase of testing. The Shermans sat in the barn exactly as they had left it the previous evening, but today's work would be far more complex than carburetor adjustment. Military vehicles required coordinated operation of transmission, steering, braking, and electrical systems that had been designed to function under combat conditions. "Morning, Bob. Ready to see if yesterday's success was a fluke?" Frank's greeting carried a note of nervous anticipation. Getting the engine to start had been encouraging, but both men understood that full operational capability remained unproven. "We'll find out soon enough. Today's agenda is transmission engagement and basic mobility testing." Bob had spent the previous evening reviewing technical manuals that covered Sherman tank drive systems and operational procedures. The transmission was a complex piece of engineering that required specific techniques for proper engagement and shifting between forward and reverse operations. "Before we try moving the tank, I want to test all the auxiliary systems with the engine running: electrical load, hydraulic pressure, cooling system performance under operational conditions." Frank nodded, appreciating Bob's methodical approach. "What should I expect if everything's working properly?" "Smooth transmission engagement, responsive steering, adequate electrical power for all systems. If we encounter problems, we'll need to diagnose and correct them before attempting any actual movement." Bob began his testing sequence by starting the engine and allowing it to warm up to normal operating temperature. The Ford GAA settled into its characteristic idle rhythm, oil pressure and coolant temperature gauges showing readings within acceptable ranges. "Electrical system first," Bob announced, switching on the tank's various electrical components in sequence. The Sherman's electrical system had been designed for battlefield reliability, with robust wiring and components capable of functioning despite vibration, moisture, and temperature extremes. Modern civilian vehicles used more sophisticated electronics, but military systems emphasized durability over complexity. Headlights, running lights, instrument panel illumination all functioning normally, Bob reported, working through his mental checklist. Generator output appears stable under electrical load. Frank watched from beside the tank as Bob systematically tested each component. "You really know what you're doing, don't you?" "I'm following procedures I've memorized from technical manuals." The key is being systematic and not rushing through critical steps. Next came the hydraulic system that powered the tank's turret traverse mechanism and gun elevation controls. Though the main gun had been deactivated for civilian ownership, testing the hydraulic components would verify the integrity of seals and pumps that hadn't operated in decades. "Hydraulic pressure building normally," Bob called out, monitoring gauges that showed system performance. No obvious leaks or pressure drops. The turret began rotating slowly as Bob engaged the traverse mechanism, its movement accompanied by the steady whine of hydraulic pumps working against mechanical resistance. After 30 years of inactivity, the system functioned with surprising smoothness. "That's incredible," Frank breathed, watching the massive gun turret swing through its full range of motion. "I never expected the hydraulics to work after all this time." Military systems were built to much higher standards than civilian equipment. Proper preservation and maintenance can keep them functional for decades. Bob shut down the hydraulic system and moved to the most critical test of the day: transmission engagement. Sherman tanks used a synchromesh transmission that required specific techniques for smooth operation, and improper engagement could damage expensive components. "Frank, I'm going to need you in the driver's position for this test. I'll call out instructions, but you'll need to operate the controls." Frank climbed into the driver's compartment, settling behind the controls he hadn't operated since his military service 7 decades earlier. "It's been a long time since I've driven one of these. The procedures haven't changed. Clutch in, transmission to first gear, gradual engagement while maintaining steady throttle." Bob positioned himself where he could monitor both the engine bay and observe the tank's movement as Frank worked through the engagement sequence. This moment would determine whether the Sherman could actually function as a mobile vehicle or remain merely a static display. "Clutch engaged, selecting first gear," Frank called out. The transmission made a solid mechanical sound as it shifted into gear, followed by the characteristic noise of the drive sprockets engaging the track system. Bob felt his pulse quicken as he realized they were seconds away from discovering whether months of preparation would translate into actual mobility. Gradually release the clutch and apply steady throttle. The Sherman lurched slightly as the clutch engaged, then began moving forward with the deliberate momentum of a machine weighing 32 tons. The track system gripped the barn's concrete floor and propelled the tank forward at walking speed, its movement accompanied by the rumble of the engine and the metallic clattering of track pads. "She's moving!" Frank shouted over the mechanical noise. Bob felt a surge of exhilaration as the Sherman demonstrated its mobility for the first time in 3 decades. The tank moved smoothly across the barn floor, its steering responsive to Frank's inputs and its engine maintaining steady power under load. "Try reverse," Bob called out. Frank shifted the transmission and backed the tank across the barn, demonstrating that all basic mobility functions were operational. The Sherman responded to steering inputs without hesitation, and the braking system brought it to smooth stops when tested. After several minutes of successful mobility testing, Frank shut down the engine and climbed out of the driver's position with obvious excitement. "Bob, that was absolutely incredible. I can't believe this old tank is actually running and driving again." Bob allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before returning to his analytical mindset. The basic systems are functional, but we still need to test sustained operation and verify that everything works reliably over time. What kind of sustained testing? Extended operation under load, steering responsiveness at different speeds, electrical system performance during extended use. We need to identify any problems that might emerge during the actual ceremony. Frank understood the logic of comprehensive testing, though his enthusiasm made him eager to declare the restoration complete. "How much more work do you think we need?" "Several days of testing and adjustment. Military vehicles have complex interactions between systems that can create problems not apparent during initial testing. As they secured the barn for lunch, Bob reflected on the morning's remarkable progress. The Sherman had exceeded his most optimistic expectations, demonstrating that proper diagnosis and methodical repair could restore even complex military systems to operational condition. However, success brought new pressure. Word of the tank's mobility would spread quickly through Ridgefield, increasing public attention and raising expectations for the Veterans Day demonstration. Bob knew that Ken Murphy would soon hear about these developments, potentially prompting some kind of response to protect his professional reputation. During lunch at Frank's kitchen table, they discussed the remaining work needed to ensure reliable operation during the ceremony. The task list included fine-tuning the engine's performance, testing the electrical system under various load conditions, and verifying that all mechanical systems could function smoothly during extended operation. Bob, I have to ask, are you surprised by how well this is going? Bob considered the question honestly. Yes and no. I expected the mechanical systems to be fundamentally sound because military vehicles were built to higher standards. But I'm surprised by how few major problems we've encountered. What does that tell you about the other mechanics who examined this tank? That they approached it as if it were a civilian vehicle with problems, rather than a military vehicle with different operating specifications? Frank nodded, understanding the distinction. In other words, they were asking the wrong questions. Exactly. Once you understand what makes military systems different, the diagnostic approach becomes more focused and effective. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors as Bob and Frank returned to the barn for continued testing. Diane Cox arrived with additional supplies, followed shortly by Dr. Eleanor Hayes from the Arkansas Military Heritage Museum. Bob had corresponded with Dr. Hayes for 2 years but never met her in person. Mr. Price, I presume? Dr. Hayes extended her hand with obvious enthusiasm. I heard through museum networks that you were working on an M4A1 restoration. I had to see it for myself. Bob shook hands with the distinguished historian, feeling somewhat intimidated by her reputation and expertise. Dr. Hayes, it's an honor to meet you. Your technical papers have been invaluable references for this project. Please, call me Eleanor. May I examine your work? Bob guided Eleanor around the Sherman, explaining the diagnostic process and repair, procedures he had used to restore the tank to operational condition. Her questions revealed deep knowledge of military vehicle systems and restoration techniques. Your approach to the carburetor problem was exactly what I would have recommended, she said, after examining the engine bay. Most civilian mechanics don't understand the critical importance of mounting angles for military carburetors. I learned that from your paper on fuel system restoration techniques. Eleanor smiled, pleased that her research had practical applications. Have you considered documenting this restoration project? The techniques you've used could be valuable for other enthusiasts working on similar vehicles. The suggestion hadn't occurred to Bob, who had been focused entirely on the immediate challenge of getting the Sherman operational. I suppose there might be interest in restoration documentation. Considerable interest. Successful M4A1 restorations are relatively rare, and your methodical approach could serve as a model for future projects. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor observed Bob's testing procedures with obvious approval. Her presence lent additional credibility to his work and provided expert validation of his restoration techniques. Frank, you found yourself an exceptional mechanic, she told the tank's owner. Mr. Price's knowledge of military vehicle systems is quite impressive for someone without formal training in the field. Frank beamed with pride at the professional endorsement. Bob's been full of surprises from the beginning. By evening, the Sherman had passed every test Bob could devise. The tank started reliably, moved smoothly in both forward and reverse, steered responsively, and operated all auxiliary systems without problems. More importantly, extended operation had revealed no hidden issues that might compromise performance during the Veterans Day ceremony. "I think we can declare this restoration successful," Bob announced as they prepared to leave the barn. Frank's expression showed pure satisfaction. "Son, you've given me something I never thought I'd see again. A working Sherman tank that honors the memory of every man who served with these machines." Eleanor approached Bob as they gathered their tools and supplies. "Mr. Price, I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity with you. The museum has been seeking a consultant for military vehicle restoration projects. Your work here suggests you might be interested in that kind of arrangement." Bob felt his pulse quicken at the unexpected offer. "What would that involve?" "Project-based consulting on restoration techniques, authentication of historical accuracy, possibly some educational programming for visitors interested in military vehicle history." The possibility of turning his passion into professional consulting work represented exactly the kind of opportunity Bob had dreamed about, but never seriously expected to encounter. "I'd definitely be interested in learning more about that." "Excellent. We'll discuss details after your Veterans Day demonstration. I suspect that event will generate considerable interest in your restoration capabilities." As Bob drove home through the gathering dusk, he reflected on a day that had exceeded his wildest expectations. The Sherman tank was fully operational. Respected experts had endorsed his work, and potential career opportunities were emerging from what had started as a simple bet with Ken Murphy. Tomorrow would bring final preparations for the Veterans Day ceremony. But tonight, Bob allowed himself to savor the satisfaction of technical achievement and professional recognition that had seemed impossible just 1 week earlier. Thursday morning brought unseasonably warm weather to Ridgefield, and with it, an atmosphere of anticipation that seemed to permeate the entire town. Veterans Day was still 3 days away, but word of Bob Price's successful tank restoration had spread beyond the agricultural community into neighboring counties. Local media had picked up the story, and Rebecca Martinez from the Ridgefield Gazette was scheduled to interview Bob and Frank that afternoon. Bob arrived at his garage to find an unexpected crowd gathered outside. Mayor Patricia Daniels stood beside her official vehicle, engaged in animated conversation with Pastor John Mitchell and Judge Harold Brennan. Their presence suggested that the tank restoration had attracted official attention from Ridgefield's civic leadership. "Bob, good morning," Mayor Daniels called out as he approached. "We were hoping to catch you before you headed out to Frank's place." Bob unlocked his garage door, gesturing for the group to follow him inside. His modest workspace looked particularly humble compared to the polished professionalism these officials were accustomed to, but their expressions showed genuine respect rather than the condescension he might have expected. "What can I do for you folks?" Judge Brennan, at 68, the senior member of the Veterans Day Planning Committee, spoke first. "Son, we understand you've accomplished something remarkable with Frank Weber's Sherman tank." "The restoration went better than expected," Bob acknowledged cautiously. Pastor Mitchell stepped forward, his expression earnest. "Bob, we've been planning this Veterans Day ceremony for months, but frankly, we never imagined we'd have a fully operational tank as the centerpiece. This changes everything in the best possible way." Mayor Daniels nodded enthusiastically. "We're expecting visitors from 3 counties now. The story has been picked up by television stations in Little Rock and Memphis. This could be the largest Veterans Day celebration Ridgefield has ever hosted." Bob felt a mixture of pride and anxiety at the implications of increased attention. His goal had been simply to win Ken Murphy's bet and demonstrate his mechanical capabilities, not to create a major public event that would scrutinize his work. under intense pressure. I appreciate the recognition, but the important thing is honoring our veterans properly." "Absolutely," Judge Brennan agreed, which brings us to why we're here. We'd like you to be part of the ceremony program. Perhaps explain to the crowd how you restored the tank and what it represents historically. The suggestion caught Bob off guard. Public speaking had never been among his strengths, and the prospect of addressing hundreds of people about his restoration work seemed daunting. "I'm not really comfortable with public speaking." "You don't need to give a lengthy speech," Pastor Mitchell assured him. "Just a few words about the restoration process and the importance of preserving military history." Mayor Daniels sensed Bob's reluctance and changed tactics. "Bob, you've given this community something special. People are excited about celebrating our veterans in a way that connects them directly to history. Your participation would mean a lot." Before Bob could respond, the sound of an expensive engine announced Ken Murphy's arrival. His pristine F-250 pulled into the parking area, and Ken emerged wearing his customary expression of professional confidence, though Bob detected subtle signs of tension beneath the surface. "Morning, folks. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Mayor Daniels turned to include Ken in the conversation. "Ken, perfect timing. We were just discussing Bob's participation in the Veterans Day ceremony." Ken's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I heard the tank made some noise yesterday. That's encouraging progress." "More than noise," Judge Brennan corrected. "According to Frank Weber, Bob has the tank fully operational. Engine, transmission, steering, the whole system." Ken's expression remained carefully neutral, but Bob noticed his hands clench slightly at his sides. "Operational is a strong word. Getting an old engine to turn over doesn't necessarily mean the vehicle is ceremony ready." "Actually," Bob said quietly, "we completed comprehensive testing yesterday. All systems are functioning normally." The statement hung in the air between them, representing far more than a simple technical update. Ken's confident prediction that the tank was unfixable had been definitively proven wrong, and everyone present understood the implications for his professional reputation. "Well," Ken said after a long pause, "I suppose we'll see how well everything holds up under actual operating conditions." Pastor Mitchell, sensing tension, quickly redirected the conversation. "The important thing is that we'll have a meaningful centerpiece for honoring our veterans." After the officials departed, Ken lingered in Bob's garage, ostensibly examining some of the technical manuals scattered across the workbench. His casual interest didn't fool Bob, who recognized this as an attempt to assess the extent of his military vehicle knowledge. "Quite a collection of reference materials," Ken observed, flipping through a Sherman maintenance manual. "Must have cost a fortune to assemble all this. I've been collecting them for years. Military vehicle documentation isn't cheap, but it's essential for proper restoration work." Ken paused at a page showing detailed carburetor specifications. "Interesting. These military carburetors are quite different from civilian units. Different enough that standard automotive diagnostic procedures might miss critical problems." The comment carried an obvious implication about Ken's failed diagnosis, and both men recognized it as such. Ken closed the manual and faced Bob directly. "Bob, I want you to know that I respect what you've accomplished with Frank's tank. I was wrong to dismiss its potential for restoration." The admission surprised Bob, who had expected Ken to maintain his skeptical stance regardless of evidence to the contrary. "I appreciate that. However," Ken continued, "I'm still not convinced that yesterday's success guarantees reliable operation during the ceremony. Military vehicles are notoriously unpredictable, especially after extended periods of inactivity." Bob understood the subtext. Ken was graciously acknowledging Bob's technical achievement while preserving room for face-saving if the tank failed during its public demonstration. "You're right that military vehicles can be unpredictable. That's why we've done extensive testing. to identify potential problems before the ceremony. All I'm saying is that a $5,000 bet deserves careful consideration of all possible outcomes. After Ken departed, Bob drove to Frank's farm with mixed feelings about the morning's conversations. Official recognition of his restoration work was gratifying, but the pressure of public expectations created new anxieties about the ceremony's success. Frank met him at the barn with obvious excitement. "Bob, my phone's been ringing all morning. Reporters, veterans organizations, even some folks from the State Historical Society. Everyone wants to know about the tank restoration. I heard we're expecting a large crowd for the ceremony, largest Veterans Day celebration in the county's history, according to Mayor Daniels. Television crews, newspaper reporters, maybe even some military officials from Fort Chaffee." Bob felt the weight of increased responsibility settling on his shoulders. What had started as a personal challenge to prove his mechanical capabilities had evolved into a major public event that would be scrutinized by experts and enthusiasts from across the region. "Frank, what if something goes wrong during the demonstration?" Frank studied Bob's concerned expression. "Son, you've done everything possible to ensure the tank operates reliably. Sometimes you have to trust your preparation and accept that mechanical systems can be unpredictable." They spent the morning conducting final operational checks, starting the engine and testing all systems one more time. The Sherman performed flawlessly, responding to every input with the smooth precision of a well-maintained machine. Engine temperature normal, oil pressure steady, electrical systems functioning properly, Bob reported, working through his checklist. "Everything looks good for the ceremony." At noon, Rebecca Martinez arrived for the scheduled interview, accompanied by a photographer from the regional newspaper. Rebecca was 29, energetic, and obviously excited about covering what she considered the biggest story to emerge from Ridgefield in years. "Mr. Price, how does it feel to have accomplished something that 3 other mechanics declared impossible?" Bob considered his response carefully, aware that his words would be read by thousands of people. "I approached the problem differently because I understood military vehicle specifications. The other mechanics were highly competent, but they were working outside their area of expertise. What inspired your interest in military vehicles?" "My grandfather served in the Pacific during World War II. He always talked about how Sherman tanks saved lives and won battles. Working on this restoration feels like honoring that legacy." Rebecca's questions revealed that she had done considerable research about military vehicle restoration and the historical significance of Sherman tanks. Her article would provide context that helped readers understand the technical achievement Bob had accomplished. Dr. Eleanor Hayes from the Arkansas Military Heritage Museum told me your restoration techniques were exemplary. Do you plan to pursue military vehicle consulting professionally? The question touched on possibilities Bob was still processing. There might be opportunities to work on similar projects. I'd certainly be interested in helping preserve military history through vehicle restoration. The photographer captured images of Bob explaining the tank's systems to Rebecca, Frank demonstrating the driver's controls, and the Sherman tank in its fully restored condition. These pictures would accompany the article and provide visual documentation of the successful restoration. As the interview concluded, Rebecca asked one final question that caught Bob off guard. "Mr. Price, Ken Murphy has been quoted as saying that military vehicles are inherently unreliable and shouldn't be operated in public demonstrations. How do you respond to that concern?" Bob chose his words carefully, aware that his response would likely be read by Ken and others in the automotive community. Military vehicles were designed to operate under combat conditions far more demanding than a Veterans Day ceremony. When properly maintained and operated, they're actually more reliable than many civilian vehicles because they were built to higher standards. So you're confident the tank will perform properly during the ceremony? I'm confident that we've done everything possible to ensure reliable operation. The tank has passed every test we could devise, and all systems are functioning according to military specifications. After Rebecca and the photographer departed, Bob and Frank spent the afternoon conducting final preparations for the ceremony. They reviewed operational procedures, double-checked all systems one more time, and discussed contingency plans for potential problems that might emerge during the demonstration. Bob, regardless of what happens Sunday, you've already achieved something remarkable. This tank hasn't run in 30 years, and you brought it back to life through knowledge and determination. The real test comes when we're in front of hundreds of people with television cameras recording everything. Frank's expression grew serious. Son, I've been thinking about something all day. Whatever happens during the ceremony, you've already won Ken Murphy's bet. This tank is operational, exactly as the terms specified. Bob had been so focused on preparation for the ceremony that he hadn't considered the formal resolution of the wager. Frank was right. The Sherman tank was running and driving, which met the conditions Ken had established. I suppose you're right about the bet, but the ceremony is about more than proving Ken wrong. Of course it is, but winning that bet means you've validated everything you've worked toward. Your knowledge, your approach, your belief in yourself, all of it has been proven correct. As evening approached, Bob felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the approaching ceremony. The Sherman tank was ready, his technical knowledge had been vindicated, and recognition was coming from multiple directions. Yet the public nature of the demonstration created pressure unlike anything he had experienced before. Driving home through Ridgefield's quiet streets, Bob noticed Veterans Day decorations appearing on houses and businesses throughout the town. American flags hung from porches, and banners promoting Sunday's ceremony were displayed in store windows. The entire community was preparing to honor its veterans in a way that his restoration work had made possible. At home, Bob found Cindy waiting with a bottle of wine and a home-cooked dinner. Her expression showed pride mixed with concern about the pressure he was facing. "How are you feeling about Sunday?" Bob sat down beside her, accepting the glass of wine she offered. Nervous, excited, proud, terrified, pretty much every emotion at once. The whole town is talking about what you've accomplished. People are genuinely impressed by your technical knowledge and dedication. I just hope everything goes smoothly during the ceremony. A lot of people are expecting something special. Cindy studied his face, recognizing the weight of responsibility he was carrying. Bob, you've already proven everything you set out to prove. Sunday is about celebrating veterans and sharing your accomplishment with the community. I know you're right. It's just hard to believe how quickly everything has changed. As they shared dinner, Bob reflected on the remarkable transformation his life had undergone in less than 2 weeks. From struggling small-town mechanic to recognized military vehicle restoration expert, with opportunities emerging that he had never imagined possible. Sunday would bring the ultimate test of his technical achievement and professional credibility. But tonight, he allowed himself to appreciate how far he had already come from the moment he accepted Ken Murphy's seemingly impossible challenge. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear over Ridgefield, with autumn sunlight filtering through the remaining leaves on the courthouse square's ancient oak trees. Bob woke before his alarm, his stomach tight with anticipation for what would either be the greatest triumph or most spectacular failure of his professional life. By 7 o'clock, he was dressed and reviewing his final checklist of pre-ceremony preparations. The drive to Frank's farm took him past early arrivals already claiming parking spots along County Road 47. Cars with license plates from 3 states lined the shoulders, and Bob counted at least 2 television news vans among the vehicles. What had started as a local Veterans Day observance was transforming into a regional event that would be scrutinized by thousands of people. Frank met him at the barn wearing his dress military uniform from World War II, the ribbons and medals, carefully arranged according to regulations he still remembered after 7 decades. At 72, he carried himself with the dignity befitting someone who had served his country with distinction in the Pacific Theater. "Big day, son. How are you feeling?" Bob gestured toward the growing crowd visible through the barn's windows. "Like I'm about to find out whether everything I think I know about military vehicles is actually true. The tank's ready. Question is whether you're ready." They spent 30 minutes conducting final operational checks, starting the Sherman's engine and cycling through all systems one last time. The Ford GAA rumbled to life with reassuring smoothness, oil pressure and coolant temperature gauges showing. Normal readings within seconds of startup, engine parameters nominal, electrical systems functioning, hydraulic pressure building normally, Bob reported, working through his memorized checklist. Frank climbed into the driver's position and tested the transmission engagement, steering response, and braking systems. Everything functioned with the precision Bob had worked to achieve through careful restoration and adjustment. "She's running like a Swiss watch, Bob. Whatever happens today, you've earned the right to be proud of this accomplishment." At 9:30, Mayor Patricia Daniels arrived with the ceremonial escort that would transport the Sherman tank from Frank's farm to the courthouse square. The procession included police vehicles, fire trucks, and an honor guard from the local VFW post, all positioned to ensure safe passage through Ridgefield streets. "Bob, the crowd downtown is already larger than we anticipated," Mayor Daniels reported. "Parking lots are full, and people are walking from 3 blocks away to reach the square." Bob felt his anxiety increase as the scope of public attention became apparent. "How many people are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate? 800, maybe 1,000 by ceremony time. We've got visitors from Arkansas, Missouri, and Tennessee, plus media representatives from Little Rock and Memphis." The enormity of the audience waiting to witness his restoration work struck Bob like a physical blow. He had imagined addressing a few dozen local residents, not nearly 1,000 people who had traveled specifically to see the Sherman tank demonstration. "Bob," Frank said quietly, "remember that most of these folks know nothing about military vehicle restoration. They're not here to judge your technical expertise. They're here to honor veterans and witness something historically significant." At 10 o'clock, the procession began its journey toward downtown Ridgefield. Frank drove the Sherman tank with practiced skill, while Bob rode in the passenger compartment, monitoring gauges and systems for any signs of trouble. The tank's tracks gripped the asphalt smoothly, and the engine maintained steady power as they traveled through residential neighborhoods lined with cheering spectators, engine temperature holding steady, electrical load balanced, no warning indicators, Bob called out over the mechanical noise. The Sherman's arrival at the courthouse square created a stir that exceeded even Bob's expanded expectations. Hundreds of people pressed forward to photograph the tank, while children pointed excitedly at the massive vehicle that seemed to have emerged from history books into their small Arkansas town. Bob climbed out of the tank to find himself immediately surrounded by reporters, photographers, and curious spectators asking questions about the restoration process. The attention was overwhelming, but he forced himself to remain calm and provide coherent answers about his technical approach. "Mr. Price, can you explain how you succeeded where other mechanics failed?" asked a television reporter from Little Rock. "Military vehicles require specialized knowledge that isn't covered in standard automotive training. I approached the problem with an understanding of Sherman tank specifications rather than civilian vehicle assumptions." "What was the key breakthrough that got the engine running?" Bob explained the carburetor alignment issue in terms accessible to non-technical audiences, emphasizing the importance of understanding original military engineering rather than applying conventional repair methods. As the formal ceremony began, Bob found himself seated on the platform with local officials, veterans organization representatives, and distinguished guests who had traveled from across the region to witness the event. The crowd stretched beyond the courthouse square into adjacent streets, with late arrivals watching from windows and rooftops. Judge Harold Brennan served as master of ceremonies, opening with remarks about the importance of preserving military history and honoring those who had served. His introduction of Bob received enthusiastic applause that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce Bob Price, the young man whose dedication and expertise brought this Sherman tank back to life after 30 years of silence. Bob approached the microphone with considerable nervousness, looking out over a sea of faces that included everyone from World War II veterans to elementary school children. He had prepared brief remarks about the restoration process, but the size and diversity of the audience made his planned speech seem inadequate. "Thank you for being here today to honor our veterans," he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "This Sherman tank represents more than just mechanical restoration. It's a connection to the courage and sacrifice of the men who operated these machines in combat." He explained the restoration process in general terms, emphasizing how military vehicles were designed to standards that civilian mechanics might not fully appreciate. His description of the diagnostic challenges and solution methods held the audience's attention, even those with no mechanical background. "The most important thing I learned during this project is that preserving military history requires understanding not just how these machines worked, but why they were built the way they were. Every design decision reflected the reality that lives depended on reliable operation under impossible conditions." The crowd's response was enthusiastic, but Bob noticed several people in the audience who stood out from the local residents and regional visitors. 3 men in military uniforms were taking notes and photographing the tank with obvious professional interest. After Bob's presentation, the ceremony continued with speeches from veterans representatives and a demonstration of the Sherman's operational capabilities. Frank drove the tank through its paces, showing how the transmission, steering, and auxiliary systems functioned under load. The crowd cheered as the massive vehicle maneuvered around the courthouse square with surprising agility. During a break in the formal program, one of the uniformed observers approached Bob with obvious purpose. The man's bearing and insignia identified him as a senior military officer, and his expression suggested this was more than casual interest in the restoration project. "Mr. Price, I'm General Mike Ward, recently retired from the Army Materiel Command. I'd like to speak with you about your restoration work." Bob felt his pulse quicken at the introduction. General Ward's position would have involved oversight of military vehicle development and maintenance programs, making his opinion particularly significant. "General, it's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine, son. I've been watching your presentation and examining your restoration work. Frankly, I'm impressed by both your technical knowledge and your understanding of military vehicle design philosophy." General Ward's assessment carried weight that transcended local recognition or regional media attention. This was validation from someone who understood military systems at the highest levels of responsibility. "Thank you, sir. I've tried to approach this project with respect for the original engineering." "That shows, and it's exactly the kind of perspective we need for a project I'd like to discuss with you." Before General Ward could elaborate, Mayor Daniels approached to introduce him to other ceremony participants. He handed Bob a business card with his contact information. "Mr. Price, I'll be in the area until Wednesday. Would you be available to meet tomorrow morning? I have a proposition that might interest you." "Certainly, General. What time would work? For you? 8 o'clock at your garage, if that's convenient. I'd like to see your workspace and discuss your background in more detail. As General Ward moved away to continue observing the ceremony, Bob studied the business card with growing excitement. The General's obvious interest suggested possibilities beyond anything he had imagined when accepting Ken Murphy's original bet. The ceremony concluded with a traditional 21-gun salute and the playing of taps, creating a solemn moment that honored all veterans regardless of their era of service. Bob found himself moved by the collective respect shown for military sacrifice and proud that his restoration work had contributed to such a meaningful observance. As the crowd began dispersing, Ken Murphy approached Bob with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal disappointment. He carried an envelope that obviously contained the $5,000 specified in their original wager. "Bob, I want to congratulate you on an exceptional piece of work. Your restoration of this tank exceeded anything I thought possible. Thank you, Ken. That means a lot coming from you." Ken handed him the envelope with obvious reluctance. "A bet is a bet, and you've clearly won this one. The tank is fully operational, exactly as the terms required." Bob accepted the money, but felt no satisfaction in Ken's defeat. The older mechanic's professional reputation had been damaged by his confident prediction that the tank was unfixable, and Bob understood the personal cost of such public error. "Ken, your diagnostic work eliminated several potential problems and helped me focus on the real issues. This restoration built on the foundation you and the others established." Ken's expression showed appreciation for Bob's diplomatic response. "Still, you succeeded where I failed, and that deserves recognition." As the afternoon wound down, Bob reflected on a day that had exceeded his wildest expectations. The Sherman tank had performed flawlessly during the ceremony. His restoration techniques had received professional validation, and opportunities were emerging that could transform his entire career trajectory. Frank Weber approached as Bob prepared to leave the courthouse square. "Son, you've given me something I never expected to see again. A working Sherman tank honoring the memory of every man who served with these machines. It was an honor to work on such an important piece of history. More than that, you've shown this community what can be accomplished through knowledge, dedication, and respect for the past. That's a lesson worth remembering." Driving home through Ridgefield's quiet streets, Bob felt the weight of success settling around him like a comfortable blanket. The $5,000 in his pocket represented immediate financial relief, but General Ward's interest suggested possibilities that could reshape his entire professional future. Tomorrow morning would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, Bob allowed himself to savor the satisfaction of a job well done and a community's recognition of his unlikely expertise. The struggling small-town mechanic had proven that passionate dedication could achieve results that formal credentials alone might not accomplish. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Eleanor Hayes. "Watch the ceremony coverage on television. Exceptional work. Let's discuss consulting opportunities this week." As Bob parked in front of his garage, he noticed that someone had placed a small American flag beside his front door, apparently in recognition of his contribution to the Veterans Day observance. The gesture, probably from a local resident he had never met, touched him more deeply than all the formal recognition he had received during the ceremony. The boy who had promised his grandfather to honor military sacrifice had become a man capable of preserving history through mechanical expertise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was for quiet satisfaction in a promise kept and a dream realized. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often follows significant events, as if the universe was clearing the stage for whatever comes next. Bob arrived at his garage 30 minutes early, using the extra time to organize his workspace and review the technical documentation that had guided his Sherman tank restoration. At precisely 8 o'clock, a black government sedan pulled into his parking area. General Mike Ward stepped out of the vehicle wearing civilian clothes, but his bearing unmistakably identified him as career military. 2 other men emerged from the sedan, one in uniform carrying a briefcase, the other in a business suit with the purposeful demeanor of someone accustomed to complex negotiations. "Mr. Price, thank you for making time this morning. I'd like you to meet Colonel James Foster from Fort Chaffee and David Richardson from the Pentagon's Defense Logistics Agency." Bob shook hands with each man, noting the formality that suggested this meeting involved more than casual interest in his restoration work. Colonel Foster appeared to be in his early 50s, with the technical background evident in how he examined Bob's garage setup. Richardson was younger, perhaps 40, with the analytical expression of someone who evaluated projects for feasibility and cost-effectiveness. "Gentlemen, welcome to Price Auto Repair. It's not much to look at, but it's where the tank restoration happened." General Ward smiled at Bob's modest assessment. "Son, some of the most important work in this country gets done in places that don't look impressive from the outside." Bob guided them through his garage, explaining the technical resources he had assembled over the years and demonstrating the methodical approach he used for complex mechanical problems. Colonel Foster examined his collection of military vehicle manuals with obvious appreciation. "This is quite an impressive reference library, Mr. Price. Some of these documents are difficult to obtain even through military channels. I've been collecting them for years through correspondence with museums, restoration groups, and private collectors. Technical knowledge is only as good as the documentation that supports it." Richardson took notes as Bob explained his diagnostic methodology and repair procedures. "Mr. Price, your restoration of the Sherman tank has attracted attention at very high levels within the Department of Defense." "What kind of attention?" "General." Ward gestured toward the folding chairs Bob had arranged for the meeting. "That's what we're here to discuss. Mind if we sit down and talk about some opportunities that might interest you?" Bob settled into his chair with growing anticipation. The presence of 3 officials from different military organizations suggested possibilities beyond anything he had imagined. "The Pentagon is developing a new program for preserving military vehicle heritage," General Ward began. "We're facing a crisis in institutional knowledge as older mechanics and restoration experts retire or pass away." Colonel Foster opened his briefcase and withdrew several folders. "We have hundreds of military vehicles in museums, training facilities, and ceremonial units across the country. Many are deteriorating because we lack personnel with the specialized knowledge needed for proper maintenance and restoration. The problem isn't just mechanical," Richardson added. "It's also historical. Modern military mechanics are trained on contemporary equipment using current procedures. They don't understand the engineering philosophy and maintenance requirements of older systems." Bob nodded, recognizing the challenge they described. "Military vehicles from different eras require different approaches, even when they appear mechanically similar." "Exactly," General Ward said. "Your restoration of Frank Weber's Sherman tank demonstrated precisely the kind of specialized knowledge we need to preserve." Colonel Foster opened one of the folders, revealing photographs of various military vehicles in different states of disrepair. "These are just examples from Fort Chaffee alone. M60 tanks, M113 armored personnel carriers, various support vehicles that are historically significant but mechanically non-functional. Some of these vehicles are the last operational examples of their type," Richardson explained. "Once they're gone, that piece of military history disappears forever." Bob studied the photographs, noting the variety of vehicles and the complexity of restoration challenges they would present. Each machine represented different engineering approaches and maintenance requirements that would demand extensive research and specialized knowledge. "What exactly are you proposing?" General Ward leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "We want to offer you a position as Chief Restoration Specialist for the Pentagon's Military Vehicle Heritage Preservation Program." The magnitude of the offer struck Bob like a physical blow. He had expected some kind of consulting arrangement, not a senior position in a major Pentagon initiative. "The program is still being developed," Richardson continued, "but the scope is substantial. You would oversee restoration projects at military installations across the country, train personnel in specialized maintenance procedures, and develop documentation for preserving institutional knowledge." Colonel Foster added practical details. "The position would be based at Fort Chaffee initially, with travel to other installations as needed. You'd have access to technical resources, specialized equipment, and a staff of mechanics who would work under your supervision." Bob's mind raced through the implications of such an opportunity. It represented everything he had dreamed about during years of studying military vehicle systems, but the scale and responsibility seemed almost overwhelming. What qualifications would be required for a position like that? "The qualifications you've already demonstrated," General Ward replied. "Technical expertise in military vehicle systems, understanding of historical preservation requirements, and the ability to diagnose and solve complex mechanical problems." "Mr. Price," Richardson said, "your restoration of the Sherman tank showed us that formal education isn't as important as practical knowledge and dedication to excellence. We need someone who understands these machines the way you do." Bob felt the weight of the offer settling around him. "What would this mean for my business here in Ridgefield?" "That would be your decision," General Ward acknowledged. "The program could accommodate part-time consulting if you preferred to maintain your independent operation, though we believe the scope of work would eventually require full-time commitment." Colonel Foster provided additional context. "The Pentagon has allocated substantial funding for this program over the next 5 years. We're talking about preserving military heritage on a scale that's never been attempted before." "How substantial?" Richardson's expression grew more serious. "The initial budget authorization is $28 million for the first phase alone." The figure was so large that Bob had difficulty processing its implications. $28 million represented more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, deployed for work that aligned perfectly with his passionate interests. "We're not expecting an immediate answer," General Ward said, recognizing Bob's need to absorb the magnitude of what they were proposing. "This is a major life decision that deserves careful consideration." "What kind of timeline are we discussing?" "The program officially launches in 6 months, Colonel Foster explained. "If you're interested, we'd like to begin preliminary work within the next few weeks to establish procedures and identify priority projects." Bob struggled to formulate coherent questions about an opportunity that exceeded his wildest ambitions. "Would I be working alone or with a team?" "Initially with a small team of military mechanics who would learn specialized restoration techniques." "Oh, from you," Richardson answered. "As the program expands, you'd oversee regional teams at installations across the country. The goal is to create a sustainable system for preserving military vehicle heritage," General Ward added. "Your knowledge would be multiplied through training other personnel in proper restoration procedures." Bob realized they were offering him the chance to become exactly what he had dreamed of being, a recognized expert in military vehicle restoration, with resources to preserve history on a national scale. "I'm definitely interested, but I need to discuss this with my girlfriend and consider the practical implications." "Of course," General Ward said. Take all the time you need. This is too important a decision to rush. Colonel Foster provided contact information and preliminary documentation about the program structure. Mr. Price will be conducting site visits at several military installations over the next month. Would you be interested in accompanying us to see the scope of restoration work that needs to be done? Absolutely. That would help me understand what I'd be getting into. Richardson closed his folder and prepared to leave. Mr. Price, I want you to understand something important. This program exists because your restoration work demonstrated that specialized knowledge can achieve results that conventional approaches can't match. We're not just offering you a job, General Ward added. We're asking you to help preserve a crucial part of American military history for future generations. After the three officials departed, Bob sat alone in his garage trying to process the conversation that had just transformed his understanding of what was possible. The Pentagon was offering him the opportunity to turn his passion into a career of national significance, with resources and authority beyond anything he had imagined. His phone rang, displaying Cindy's number. She was calling during her lunch. A break, probably expecting to hear about a routine meeting with some military officials. How did it go with the general? Bob struggled to find words that adequately conveyed what had just transpired. Cindy, you're not going to believe this. They offered me a position running a Pentagon program for military vehicle restoration. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Bob wondered if the call had dropped. A Pentagon program? Bob, what exactly does that mean? It means they want me to oversee restoration projects at military bases across the country. They're talking about a $28 million budget and a staff of mechanics who would work under my supervision. That's incredible. Are you going to accept? Bob realized he hadn't seriously considered the possibility of declining such an extraordinary opportunity. I think so, but it would mean major changes for both of us. What kind of changes? The position would be based at Fort Chaffee initially, with travel to other installations. It might mean relocating, depending on how the program develops. Cindy absorbed this information quietly. Bob, this is what you've been working toward your entire adult life. You can't pass up an opportunity like this. But what about us? What about your job at the hospital? We'll figure that out. The important thing is that you have the chance to do work that really matters to you. After the call ended, Bob walked through his modest garage with new perspective. The workspace that had seemed adequate for his independent operation would be replaced by fully equipped military facilities with resources he had never dreamed of accessing. Yet leaving Ridgefield meant abandoning the community that had supported him during his transformation from struggling mechanic to recognized expert. Frank Weber, Diane Cox, and even Ken Murphy had played crucial roles in his development, and simply walking away felt like betrayal. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors wanting to discuss the ceremony and Bob's restoration work. Word of the Pentagon officials' visit had spread quickly through Ridgefield's efficient gossip network, creating speculation about Bob's future plans. Frank Weber arrived in the late afternoon, his expression showing concern about rumors he had heard. Bob, is it true that the Pentagon wants to hire you? Bob explained the morning's conversation and the scope of the opportunity he had been offered. Frank listened with obvious pride, mixed with disappointment at the prospect of losing someone he had come to regard as both friend and technical expert. Son, that's the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime. You'd be crazy not to accept it. It would mean leaving Ridgefield and everything I've built here. Frank's expression grew thoughtful. Bob, what you've built here is knowledge and reputation. Those things travel with you wherever you go. But this community gave me the chance to prove what I could do. And now it's time to take that proof to a place where it can make a bigger difference. Military history deserves to be preserved, and you're the right person to do it. As evening approached, Bob realized that his decision was already made, even if he hadn't formally acknowledged. The Pentagon program represented everything he had worked toward, and passing up such an opportunity would mean betraying his own dreams and the memory of his grandfather's military service. The boy who had promised to honor veterans had become a man capable of preserving their legacy on a national scale. Tomorrow would bring the formal acceptance of a challenge larger than any he had previously faced, but tonight was for appreciating how far he had traveled from the struggling mechanic who had accepted Ken Murphy's impossible bet just 2 weeks earlier. 3 months later, Bob stood in a state-of-the-art restoration facility at Fort Chaffee, watching his team of military mechanics work on a 1943 M3 half-track that hadn't run since the Carter administration. The contrast with his former garage in Ridgefield was stark. Computerized diagnostic equipment, hydraulic lifts, and specialized tools that cost more than his entire previous operation. "Mr. Price, the fuel injection system is responding normally. Now," called Sergeant First Class Janet Mills, one of the 6 mechanics assigned to his restoration team. "Whatever adjustment you made to the timing seems to have resolved the hesitation problem." Bob nodded with satisfaction, noting how quickly his team had absorbed the diagnostic techniques he developed for older military vehicles. Janet Mills possessed exceptional mechanical aptitude, and her eagerness to learn specialized restoration procedures reminded him of his own passion for military vehicle systems. "Good work, Sergeant. Document the procedure in detail so we can reference it for similar vehicles." The documentation process had become a crucial component of Bob's new responsibilities. Every successful repair was recorded with photographs, technical specifications, and step-by-step procedures that would preserve institutional knowledge for future restoration projects. Colonel Foster approached from his office overlooking the restoration bay, carrying a folder that Bob recognized as containing their next assignment. "Bob, how's the half-track progressing?" "Should be completed by Friday. We've resolved the fuel system issues and verified that all drive components are operational." "Excellent. I've got something that might interest you." Colonel Foster opened the folder to reveal photographs of a massive vehicle that Bob immediately recognized as an M26 Pershing tank, one of the heaviest American tanks produced during World War II. "Where did you find that?" "National Museum of World War II in New Orleans. It's been on static display for 20 years, but they want to restore it to operational condition for their upcoming exhibition on tank development." Bob studied the photographs with professional interest. M26 Pershings were rare vehicles even when new, and finding one in restorable condition represented a significant historical discovery. "What's the timeline?" 6 months, which is aggressive, but achievable with your team's expertise. The museum is offering substantial compensation, and successful completion would generate considerable publicity for the program. The Pentagon's Military Vehicle Heritage Preservation Program had exceeded all expectations during its first quarter of operation. Bob's team had completed 8 restoration projects, trained 12 additional mechanics in specialized procedures, and developed comprehensive documentation that was being distributed to military installations worldwide. "I'll need to examine the vehicle personally before committing to that timeline." "Already arranged. You and Sergeant Mills fly to New Orleans Thursday morning for initial assessment." Bob's phone buzzed with a text message from Cindy, who was completing her nursing degree at the University of Arkansas after relocating to be closer to Fort Chaffee. Their relationship had strengthened during the transition, and she frequently visited the restoration facility to observe his work. "Speaking of personal matters," Colonel Foster said with a knowing smile, "I understand congratulations are in order." Bob's engagement to Cindy had been announced the previous week, though they hadn't set a wedding date yet. The demands of establishing the restoration program had consumed most of his time. but their shared excitement about his career transformation had brought them closer together. "Thank you, sir. We're planning a small ceremony this summer." "Excellent. Family stability is important for someone in your position." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that reminded Bob how dramatically his circumstances had changed. Ken Murphy arrived at the Fort Chaffee Gate requesting permission to tour the restoration facility, apparently curious about the operation that had evolved from their small-town competition. Bob met Ken at the facility entrance, noting how impressed the older mechanic seemed by the scale and sophistication of the military operation. "This is quite a setup, Bob, different from your old garage in Ridgefield." "Slightly better resources," Bob agreed with understatement. "What brings you to Fort Chaffee?" "Curiosity, mostly. I wanted to see what you'd accomplished with this Pentagon program." Bob guided Ken through the restoration facility, explaining the various projects and demonstrating some of the specialized equipment they used for military vehicle work. Ken's questions revealed genuine professional interest rather than competitive assessment. "How many vehicles have you restored since starting here?" 8 completed, 6 in progress, 12 more scheduled for the next quarter. We're also training mechanics at other installations to handle routine maintenance using our procedures. Ken stopped beside the half-track Bob's team was completing, examining the restored components with obvious appreciation for the quality of work. "This is exceptional craftsmanship. Your team clearly knows what they're doing. They're good people who were willing to learn specialized techniques. Military vehicle restoration requires different approaches than civilian automotive work. I'm beginning to understand that. Looking back, I realize I approached Frank's Sherman tank with completely wrong assumptions." The admission represented significant personal growth for Ken, who had built his reputation on automotive expertise that proved inadequate for military vehicle systems. "Different doesn't mean better or worse," Bob replied diplomatically. "Just different applications of mechanical knowledge." As they completed the tour, Ken's expression grew more serious. "Bob, I owe you an apology for how I handled our original disagreement. I let pride cloud my professional judgment. You took a position based on your experience. There's no shame in that. Maybe not, but there's wisdom in recognizing when someone else's expertise exceeds your own." Ken's visit concluded with a handshake that felt like genuine resolution of their past conflict. Watching him drive away from Fort Chaffee, Bob reflected on how success had allowed him to extend grace to someone who had once dismissed his capabilities. That evening, Bob returned to the small apartment he shared with Cindy near the military base. She was studying for her final nursing examinations, textbooks and notes spread across their kitchen table in organized chaos. "How was your day?" she asked, looking up from a chapter on cardiac care procedures. "Productive. We finished the half-track restoration, got approval for the Pershing tank project, and had an unexpected visit from Ken Murphy." Cindy's eyebrows rose with interest. "Ken Murphy came to Fort Chaffee? What did he want?" Bob explained the visit and Ken's apparent desire to understand the work that had evolved from their original bet. "I think he was genuinely impressed by what we've accomplished here. It's good that you two have resolved your differences. Carrying grudges isn't healthy for anyone." Bob settled beside her at the table, reviewing technical specifications for the upcoming New Orleans project. The M26 Pershing represented a significant challenge that would test his team's abilities and potentially establish new procedures for heavy tank restoration. "Cindy, do you ever miss Ridgefield?" She considered the question thoughtfully. "I miss the familiarity and the community connections, but I don't miss the limitations." "What do you mean?" "In Ridgefield, you were wasting your talents on routine automotive work because that's all that was available. Here, you're using your knowledge for something historically important." Bob nodded, understanding her perspective. The Pentagon program had provided purpose and resources that his independent garage could never have offered, even if the transition had required leaving familiar surroundings. I got a letter from Frank Weber today. He wants to donate another military vehicle to the museum, a 1944 Jeep that belonged to his unit in the Pacific. That's wonderful. Will you be able to work on it? Probably. The program encourages projects that preserve personal military history, and Frank's donations help connect modern audiences with wartime experiences. The following week brought Bob back to Ridgefield for the first time since accepting the Pentagon position. Frank Weber's Jeep donation ceremony was scheduled for Saturday, and Bob had volunteered to assess the vehicle's restoration requirements. Driving through his former hometown felt strange after months of military base life. The pace seemed slower, the buildings smaller, and the mechanical challenges less complex than what he now encountered daily at Fort Chaffee. Frank met him at the courthouse square, where the restored Sherman tank remained on permanent display as a monument to local veterans. The sight of his first major restoration success brought back memories of the nervous young mechanic who had accepted an impossible challenge. "Bob, it's good to see you again. How's life at the Pentagon?" "Challenging and rewarding in ways I never imagined. Thank you for asking." Frank's Jeep sat nearby, covered by a tarp that protected it from weather exposure. When Frank pulled away the covering, Bob was surprised by the vehicle's excellent condition. This is remarkable preservation for an 80-year-old vehicle. Pacific climate was kinder to metal than Arkansas humidity would have been. I've kept it covered and started it occasionally over the years. Bob examined the Jeep systematically, noting original components that many restored vehicles lacked. This particular machine would require minimal work to achieve operational condition, making it an ideal project for training new restoration personnel. "Frank, this Jeep could be restored to museum quality with relatively minor work. It's an exceptional example of wartime military transportation. Think your team at Fort Chaffee would be interested in taking it on?" "Absolutely. Projects like this help train mechanics in basic restoration procedures before they tackle more complex vehicles." As word of Bob's visit spread through Ridgefield, several former customers stopped by to greet him and inquire about his new career. Their obvious pride in his success touched him deeply, reminding him that small communities take genuine satisfaction in their members' achievements. Diane Cox arrived as Bob was completing his assessment of Frank's Jeep, her expression showing the same supportive enthusiasm she had displayed during his struggling mechanic days. "Bob, you look like success agrees with you. The work is everything I hoped it would be. Thank you for believing in me when most people didn't. I never doubted. You had special knowledge. I just wasn't sure you'd get the chance to prove it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor Patricia Daniels, who had been instrumental in organizing the Veterans Day ceremony that launched Bob's transformation. "Bob, wonderful to see you. The town council asked me to extend an invitation for you to speak at our Memorial Day ceremony this spring. I'd be honored, but my schedule is pretty demanding these days." "Of course. But if you can manage it, people would love to hear about your Pentagon work and how it connects to preserving military history." As the afternoon wound down, Bob reflected on how his relationship with Ridgefield had evolved. He was no longer the struggling local mechanic seeking validation, but rather a successful professional returning to share his achievements with the community that had nurtured his development. Driving back toward Fort Chaffee as sunset painted the Arkansas landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Bob felt profound satisfaction with the path his life had taken. The Pentagon program was preserving military history on a scale he had never imagined possible. His personal relationships had strengthened during the transition, and his expertise was being recognized at the highest levels of government. The Struggling young mechanic who had accepted Ken Murphy's impossible bet had become a man capable of honoring his grandfather's memory through work of national significance. Military vehicles that might have been lost to time were being preserved for future generations, and institutional knowledge was being documented to ensure that specialized restoration expertise would survive. Bob's phone rang as he approached the Fort Chaffee Gate, displaying a call from General Ward's office. The program director wanted to discuss expansion plans that would establish restoration facilities at additional military installations across the country. Mr. Price, we've received approval for Phase 2 of the Heritage Preservation Program. Are you ready to take on even greater responsibilities? Bob smiled as he answered, thinking of his grandfather's stories about military service and the importance of preserving the tools that had defended freedom. Yes, Sir General, I'm ready. The boy who had promised to honor veterans had become a man whose life's work ensured that their legacy would endure. From a small-town garage to Pentagon leadership, the journey had proven that passionate expertise could overcome any obstacle and achieve results that changed not just individual lives, but preserved history itself. As Bob drove through the military base toward home and the future that awaited, he carried with him the satisfaction of promises kept and dreams fulfilled beyond his wildest imagination. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.